He used to be called Citizen 625726. He used to call himself Unbroken. When he left his dystopian city behind, he thought he had found paradise. What he found was uglier and darker than anything he could have imagined. This is his story. This is Inferior. Now available in ebook, paperback, and audio form. Links in the description. Michael Moorcock has been writing a lot of stories for a very long time, slowly but surely building up the Moorcock Multiverse over the many decades of his long and successful career. But unlike Tolkien, who planned his fictional universe to the point of writing out a fictional history of Middle-earth before he even penned the first line of Lord of the Rings, though technically the multiverse begins with the first Elric pulp, The Dreaming City, in 1961, the ideas of the multiverse, the cosmic balance, and the eternal champion accrued slowly over the course of several years. In this time, he created Dorian Hawkmoon and Jerry Cornelius, as well as writing non-multiverse-related fiction like Behold the Man and The Chinese Agent. Then at last, in 1970, everything finally crystallized into the multiverse that we recognize now. And I believe it begins with The Eternal Champion, 1970, and its hero, Erekose. Though, considering what he does in that first book, hero might be stretching it a little. Erekose, or John Daker, or Erlic Scarsoul, or however many other identities he's assumed over his long span, is a bit difficult to talk about. At least in part because this is the one where Moorcock really goes into all the different incarnations thing. Technically, John Daker is his, quote, real identity because the story begins with the man named thus in the 20th century, but Erekose is the name he's generally known by best, especially when he cameos in other Eternal Champion stories, like, of course, Sailor on the Seas of Fate and The Quest for Tanalorn. So for the sake of consistency, I'm going to refer to him as Erekose for the duration of this video. First, I'm going to begin with the book recommendations. Once again, like every other Eternal Champion apart from Elric and Corum, Erekose has no audio adaptations, or at least no modern ones. I've heard that there were older adaptations into audio of Moorcock's work, particularly in the 80s, but I've not been able to find any, let alone if any of them were about Erekose. There are technically 4 entries in the story of Erekose. The Eternal Champion and the Phoenix and Obsidian, sometimes titled The Silver Warriors, both released in 1970, and then it seemed Moorcock ignored the character for an entire decade until 1980, while working with comic artist Howard Chaykin, released a graphic novel midquel of sorts called The Swords of Heaven, The Flowers of Hell, only finally concluding Erekose's story in 1986 with the novel The Dragon and the Sword. In contrast to the HAWKWIND video, where it was mostly about the world because that was the most interesting part, here it's going to be all about the character. Partly because I think one of the great things about the Erekose books is discovering and experiencing the strange worlds that he reincarnates into in each entry, so I'm going to try and avoid spoilers as much as I can, for all 3 books and the graphic novel. First, a bit of setup. The Eternal Champion begins with John Daker, a man in the 20th century who has a wife and child that are never really described, a job he finds unfulfilling, and basically a sense of purposelessness in his life. So of course, eventually, he starts hearing a voice calling him from across gulfs of time and space. It takes a while, but he finally answers, and reincarnates for the first time as Erekose. Then, in the second book, another summons calls him to another world and another form, Erlic Scarsoul. Then, in the graphic novel, he becomes Clan of Clengar. Then, in the third and final book, he becomes Prince Flamadon, yet another incarnation of the Eternal Champion, while simultaneously a companion to a different incarnation of the champion, Ulrich von Beck, the subject of perhaps a future video. As he travels from world to world, assumes identity after identity, and fights foe after foe, one thing guides Erekose's steps. In his first incarnation as the Eternal Champion, Erekose fell in love with Ermizad, princess of the Eldrin race. The Eldrin are basically elf-like people, sort of. They have pointy ears, dark hair, and their eyes are a solid milky blue without pupils. Erekose loved her, and then of course was separated from her by being forced to incarnate in other forms. And so the main plot of later books is essentially him trying to get back to that first world so that he can be reunited with her, exemplifying the classic theme of the Eternal Champion and his love, the Eternal Consort, being separated, a classic aspect of the multiverse. Above all else, the thing to keep in mind about Erekose is that of all the forms of the Eternal Champion across all the Moorcock books, I would argue that he is by far the most miserable, even taking into account Elric, the albino emperor of angst. And this is because he is aware of his nature in a way that no other Eternal Champion is. A few Eternal Champions are lucky enough to never learn their true nature, that they are the incarnations of a great cosmic archetype meant to be summoned over and over again to fight and suffer and eventually die when they are needed. Most do eventually, and in different ways, come to terms with that. What sets Erekose apart is that he is not only aware of his nature intellectually, he is aware of it completely, because he knows each and every one of his incarnations. He remembers the lives of Elric and Coram and all the others. And because time is purely relative in the multiverse, he has no way of knowing if these are lives that have already been lived or ones that he is going to live at a future time. And these memories and identities surface and disappear randomly from within his own skull, and so it's really a miracle that the man hasn't been driven to gibbering madness by now. As a result, the character does a great deal of introspective musings, as well as occasionally wallowing in the misery of his circumstances. Because, let's face it, the life of the Eternal Champion is a miserable one, generally speaking. You do get the occasional happy ending, but that is as rare as hen's teeth, as they used to say. Most Eternal Champions come to sticky ends, because that was just the kind of angle that Moorcock was going for. It's thematically appropriate, but it does make Erekose less accessible than some of the other Moorcock protagonists. It's true that with almost every Eternal Champion, there is the underlying themes of an inescapable fate, forever hanging over the protagonist's head like a sword of Damocles. But for some characters, like HAWKWIND, it's kind of in the background, and doesn't particularly intrude too much in what the hero is trying to achieve in that moment. For others, like Elric, the theme of the Eternal Champion's never-ending burden is far more upfront, particularly in the stories that chronicle the conclusion of the White Wolf story. Dead God's Homecoming, Black Sword's Brothers, Sad Giant's Shield, and Doomed Lord's Passing, 4 short novelettes that were eventually collected into the single novel Stormbringer. With Erekose, the nature of the Eternal Champion and the nature of his, some might say, damned existence is very much the focus of his stories. Whether he is in the form of dead Erekose himself, wielding the radioactive sword Kanajana, as Clen of Clengar fighting in an acid-scoured waste that literally lies between heaven and hell, or in the form of Erlic Scarsoul, wielding the cold sword and being drawn across the great southern ice in a sled chariot pulled by polar bears. All this is a very long-winded way of saying that Erekose is a bit harder to like than most Moorcock protagonists, and therefore his story's not the one that anyone would recommend as being your initial introduction to the multiverse. In fact, The Eternal Champion, the book, was not well received when it first came out, partly because, spoiler alert, the man commits full-on genocide in the final act of the story. I'll say no more on the matter and leave it to you to read the books and find out how exactly it comes to that if you are so inclined. That said, I can recommend this to anyone who's pretty deep into the multiverse by now and looking for something that really goes hard into exploring what the Eternal Champion is all about. I especially recommend the comic as the story is well written and Howard Chaykin's art is excellent. Every panel looks less like a comic and more of a story told in oil paintings. So by all means, if you are so inclined, imbibe in Erekose. The settings are some of the most bizarre and exotic outside of the Jerry Cornelius books, and while he is perhaps a little too maudlin of a protagonist to be identifiable, his struggle to reunite with his lost love and or possibly find peace by going to Tanalorn and silencing the memories of past and future bouncing around in his skull is certainly a fascinating one, if nothing else. And it is certainly worthwhile to experience the moment where the Moorcock Multiverse truly came into its own.